One ordinary morning, a devoted single father named James Carter was arrested for using what officers claimed was fake cash. The young officer's arrogance and blind confidence turned a routine misunderstanding into a public humiliation. But fate had its own plan, because the man they took in wasn't just any father, he was the head of Homeland Security. And when the truth surfaced, it didn't just clear his name. It exposed a system, ignited change, and proved that justice still has a voice. The sky above Washington carried that grayish calm that often comes before rain. Early light slipped through the city streets, soft and cool, touching the rooftops and quiet storefronts. James Carter stepped onto the wet sidewalk, his reflection rippling across the puddles. He held a cup of black coffee and a folder of documents for his daughter's new school semester. He always preferred to handle those things himself, call it discipline, or habit from years of managing emergencies meant to stay invisible to ordinary citizens. James had built a life from quiet stability. He woke early, cooked breakfast, dropped Ella off at school, and walked into an office that few outside government circles truly understood. But at this hour, he was only a father. A man in a grey coat who bought coffee from a corner cafe and greeted the same cashier every morning. He liked the routine. It reminded him that power only mattered if you could live gently with it. Inside the cafe, the air was warm and filled with the murmur of morning chatter. The young barista smiled as he handed her a bill, the same way he did every day. She ran the paper through her fingers distractedly, placed it in the register, and thanked him. Nothing unusual. Yet behind the counter a glance passed between her and another worker, quiet but uncertain. James didn't notice. He stepped outside, coffee steaming in his hand, humming softly under his breath. 2 blocks down, as he waited to cross the street, a patrol car rolled to a stop nearby. The sound of the engine and the flash of blue lights cut through the hum of city noise. One officer stepped out, tall, with a cleanly pressed uniform and sharp, watchful eyes. The other followed, holding a small tablet with the cafe's address still open on screen. "Sir, excuse me." The tone carried command, not anger, but something rigid. James turned, eyebrows raised. "Is there a problem, officer?" As the younger one, Harrison, judging by the name stitched above the badge, nodded toward the folder in James's hand. "You were just at Maple Cafe, correct? We've had a call concerning a possible counterfeit bill used there this morning." James blinked, taken aback by the absurdity of the claim. "Counterfeit?" He frowned slightly, his instincts still tempered by logic. "That must be a mistake. I withdrew that money yesterday from the First National ATM right next to the federal building." Harrison's jaw flexed. He gestured toward the bills in James's wallet. "Do you mind if we take a look?" James handed them over with calm politeness that didn't fit the tension forming in the air. "Go ahead," he said, his voice even. Years of training made him immune to the usual nervousness people felt under that tone. Yet the stares of the onlookers around their curiosity, their silent predictions, pressed on him. Miller, the older officer, examined the cash under the light of the street lamp. "Looks fine to me," he murmured, but Harrison was already checking the texture, tapping the edge, looking for a reason to doubt. The younger man's certainty wasn't about the bill, it was about James. "Where did you say you work, sir?" Harrison asked. James hesitated, the corner of his jaw tightening. He had answered that question countless times in controlled environments. This time was different. To explain too much here, on a public street, would sound like arrogance, but to stay silent would sound worse. "I work in federal administration," he said simply. "That's pretty vague." Harrison stepped closer now, less polite. "Can I see some ID?" James sighed faintly. He placed the coffee cup on a nearby trash can and reached for his wallet again. "Of course." It was ordinary procedure, yet the tension carved something heavier from the air. Passers-by slowed their pace, curiosity turning into tiny sparks of judgment. Harrison glanced at the ID, stared for a second too long, then returned it with a look that mixed disbelief and dismissal. "This looks official," he said, his voice flat, "but it doesn't verify authenticity. Please step aside." Miller shifted uneasily. "Come on, Harrison," he muttered. "It's probably just a mix-up." but Harrison persisted. "We'll need to take him in for verification." James's heart sank, not from guilt, but from disbelief. He exhaled slowly, searching for words that could cool the situation down without inflaming pride. "Officer," he started patiently, "this is unnecessary. I assure you. Sir, please put your hands where I can see them." The order was sharp enough to cut through his sentence. The coffee cup trembled where it rested. His pulse quickened, but his voice stayed calm, almost too calm. "I'm cooperating," he said softly. "There's no reason to raise your voice." Several pedestrians stopped altogether now. Someone held up a phone. The glow of the camera light splashed across the wet ground, recording everything. The silence before misunderstanding, the precision of authority, and the stillness of a man who had spent decades protecting the very order that now seemed to turn against him. Miller stood back, the conflict plain on his face. He knew something wasn't right, but the system had its chain of command, and in that moment Harrison's certainty overpowered his hesitation. James's mind turned inward. His years of crisis management played in his thoughts like practiced drills. He could feel how quickly ordinary moments could turn into breaking points. He had seen this before from the side of strategy meetings and reform memos, never from the pavement itself. He closed his eyes briefly, steadying his breathing. He thought of Ella, waiting for breakfast, maybe glancing at the clock. She would be worried if he didn't call by 8. The thought kept him grounded. "Officer," he said at last, his tone quieter now, but carrying weight, the kind of calm command used in national briefings. "Check the bank code on that bill before you make a mistake." Harrison hesitated for only a moment, but confidence pushed him forward. "You can clarify that at the station." His partner looked down, unwilling to meet James's eyes. The murmur of the crowd blurred into distance. Somewhere, a distant siren echoed, unconnected yet perfectly symbolic. James Carter, the man in a gray coat with no badge in sight, stood under flashing lights, neither defiant nor frightened, but surrounded by an unspoken truth. It wasn't the counterfeit bill under suspicion, it was the invisible weight of assumption, heavier than any evidence. As the patrol car door opened, he knew the day had changed course forever. The fluorescent lights inside the precinct flickered softly, casting a pale glow over the otherwise quiet holding area. James Carter sat in a small, windowless room, the folder for Ella's school now left on a metal desk out of his reach. The room was designed to feel neutral, efficient, but that morning it carried a palpable sense of isolation. Each distant step echoed down the sterile hallway, every sound sharpened by the nervous pulse in the air. James rested his hands neatly in his lap, replaying the morning's encounter on a loop in his mind. He wasn't unfamiliar with tension. His entire career had depended on keeping calm when others could not. But this kind of silence was of a different nature. Here, rational explanations rarely carried the weight they should have. He scanned the faces passing the observation window. Behind one stood Officer Harrison, still rigid, holding the folder that hadn't left James's hands since dawn. Farther back, Officer Miller watched quietly, his brow furrowed with an unease that seemed to be growing by the minute. Miller's discomfort was plain, though he said little. He wanted to trust procedure, but each time he glimpsed James's paperwork, a memory nagged at him. He'd heard the name Carter before, somewhere official, though he couldn't place it. In the squad room, Harrison leaned over the reception desk, exchanging quick words with the desk sergeant. He says he works in federal admin. Still, why not cooperate if he's got nothing to hide? Harrison asked, sounding somewhere between defensive and annoyed. The sergeant shook his head. "You get a feeling for people in this job, son. This one's not what he seems. Just make sure you're right before you go any further." On the other side of town, Ella sat at the kitchen table waiting for a call that usually came like clockwork. The clock hands crept forward in silence. Out of habit, she checked her phone, tapping out a message for her dad. "Are you almost home? Don't forget the syrup." The message went unread, settling with a small digital chime that no one heard. Hours passed. The room grew colder as another shift took over at the front desk. James stayed silent as officers came and left, each casting a curious look but moving on. His nerves remained hidden behind a mask of quiet patience. He thought of his father's advice. Always maintain dignity, even when it feels like you're being watched more closely than everyone else. As the sun climbed higher, someone somewhere started asking the right questions. In a government office across town, an assistant noticed Carter's absence from an important security briefing. She tried his home, then his office, and finally routed a call to the police precinct, inquiring about a missing department head. The connection was slow layers of bureaucracy hesitating to align, but the first seed of doubt was planted. Back at the precinct, Officer Miller finally decided to act. He pulled Harrison aside, his voice low. "Did you run that name in the federal database like I asked? Something about it feels off." Harrison shrugged, still clutching paperwork. "We'll check after lunch. We have his ID and the cache for evidence." "You should check now," Miller pressed, a note of urgency rising in his tone. James, meanwhile, sat quietly, his thoughts on Ella's smile, the taste of pancakes, the small things that grounded him in moments like these. He knew the process well enough to sense when something was shifting beyond his view. Somewhere, the puzzle was coming together. He let the feeling of isolation settle, always choosing patience over fear. In the midst of the city's endless movement, for a few more hours, the truth about James Carter, his responsibilities, his character, and everything he represented remained locked behind a nondescript door, waiting for the outline of his story to be recognized at last. The precinct's quiet atmosphere suddenly shifted as Detective Rebecca Lawson entered the room, her steps measured yet urgent. She was known within the department not only for her sharp instincts but also for her refusal to let bureaucracy obscure the truth. Her dark eyes scanned the files spread across the interrogation table and then landed on the ID card lying near James Carter. Without hesitation, she called for the federal system to be accessed. The screen flickered to life, a flurry of data appearing, security clearances, recent activity logs, top-secret files. The name James Carter was bold in the system, tagged as the head of the Department of Homeland Security, a man trusted with the nation's safety, the unseen guardian of borders, emergency responses, and internal crises. Rebecca's breath caught for a second. How had this man, intellectual and careful, ended up handcuffed in a holding cell over a question of counterfeit money? She immediately moved to clarify the situation, but the damage done couldn't be undone with words alone. She tapped a code on her secure device and relayed the information in rapid succession. "Unit 5, we've detained the wrong person. James Carter, Department of Homeland Security, verified. Need immediate release protocol." At her words, the room shifted. Officers who had moments before doubted the situation now looked on with surprise mingled with guilt. Harrison's jaw tightened, the weight of error pressing down on him, yet pride kept him from uttering an apology. James was led from the holding room, his posture erect despite the hours lost in waiting. As he passed through the corridor, the whispers of the officers brushed past like fleeting shadows. Some eyes reflected doubt, others grudging respect. He met Rebecca's gaze briefly and nodded, a silent understanding passed between them. No bitterness marred his stance, only quiet resolve. When he was alone finally, James allowed a long breath to escape. The calm he had maintained was not a sign of surrender, but of strategy. The injustice of this arrest was not just personal. It was systemic, a chasm between public perception and reality that had to be bridged. He returned to the small office later that afternoon, the weight of his dual roles settling on his shoulders. The importance of his work inside the government building was matched only by the urgent need to address failures in the very institutions meant to protect everyone. Public trust was fragile. This arrest, mistaken though it was, had become a symbol. A tangible example of how deep misunderstandings about race, authority, and identity could ripple through society. News cameras outside caught the moment he stepped into his car. James Carter, no longer detainee, but leader. His statement to reporters was measured, acknowledging the error but focusing on the need for reform. "We are committed to justice, not just in law enforcement, but in how we see and treat each other." Back at home, Ella was waiting with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. She hugged her father tightly, the silence between them speaking louder than any words. The day was over, but the echoes of what had happened far from quiet. James sat at the kitchen table, listening to his daughter's soft questions about the morning. He explained gently, choosing words that would empower her, that would shape how she saw the world complex but full of hope. The story had taken a turn. Not only was he freed from wrongful accusations, but he now carried an even heavier responsibility, to ensure no one else would have to face what he did without the truth shining through. In that moment, James Carter was not just the head of Homeland Security. He was a father, a symbol, and a man determined to turn a painful mistake into lasting change. Morning sunlight stretched across the marble floors of the Department of Homeland Security. The city had been buzzing for 2 days with headlines, commentary, and televised debates about the arrest that never should have happened. Despite James Carter's decision not to pursue legal action, the story had already escaped his control. It had become a mirror reflecting the errors and conflicts woven through the very system he had promised to protect. He stood by the window of his office, watching the reflection of the Capitol shimmer faintly against the clouds. In the glass, he saw not only his own face, but the quiet responsibility it carried. The need to turn outrage into reform, humiliation into purpose. The same streets where he had been stopped were now flooded with journalists. His every word mattered now more than it ever had before. A soft knock broke his thoughts. Rebecca Lawson stepped inside, a folder tucked under her arm. Her presence was composed, but her eyes showed the remorse of a woman who had watched the system make a painful mistake. "They're ready for you downstairs," she said. "Press conference room." He gave a small nod, no trace of resentment in his voice. "Then it's time we speak the truth, calmly but clearly." The ride down in the elevator felt longer than usual. A reflection of two people, one a leader, one an officer, captured between steel walls and silence. When the doors opened, the sound of cameras, flashes, murmurs filled the hall. Dozens of reporters waited, microphones extended like reaching hands. James stepped forward. For a moment the noise faded as he began to speak, voice low but steady. "Yesterday reminded me how fragile perception can be," he said, his tone firm yet calm. "A misunderstanding spiraled into something that should never have happened. I hold no anger, but this moment cannot be forgotten. It shows us that training, awareness, and empathy must not be optional requirements. They are the foundation of justice." He paused then, meeting the gaze of every journalist as though each one carried a question that deserved an answer. "We talk about security in terms of borders, codes, and threats," he continued, "but there's another form of security, human security. The feeling that you can walk your own streets and be seen for who you truly are." Outside the building, people had gathered, a blend of reporters, office workers, and citizens, drawn by the magnitude of the event. On one corner, a group held signs thanking him for his grace. On another, others demanded deeper change in the system. Both sides, though different, were drawn by the undeniable truth that this moment had exposed something too long ignored. Later that evening, back in his office, James reviewed proposals drafted with Rebecca's help. They outlined a new program mandatory empathy and scenario-based training across all federal and local law enforcement agencies. It wasn't a punishment. It wasn't revenge. It was a bridge, a way to ensure that understanding could be taught, not just enforced. Hours passed in quiet productivity. The city lights outside looked like constellations fallen to earth, steady and distant. On his desk sat a framed picture, Ella, smiling, missing a front tooth, holding a bowl of pancake batter. That image grounded him more than any official report ever could. When he returned home, Ella greeted him with cautious joy. "You're okay now?" she asked. James knelt beside her. "I'm okay," he said softly. "But what happened, it matters. Not because it hurt, but because it can help others see better." She looked at him silently, as if imprinting the words into memory, before running off to the kitchen. The smell of maple syrup filled the air within minutes, blending the scent of morning warmth into the calm of night. As the evening deepened, the messages began coming in. From governors, from international allies, from ordinary citizens who had watched, outraged and inspired. His quiet dignity had done what anger alone could not. He had reminded millions that power was not just authority, but restraint, courage, and clarity. In the days that followed, briefings evolved into open discussions. Task forces began adopting the new framework. The program, named Project Horizon, became more than a bureaucratic reform. It became a statement of trust rebuilt. Schools and universities cited it in lectures about leadership and ethics. And somewhere in the back of every meeting, James Carter's name carried a weight not born from office, but from the day he stood accused and chose composure over resentment. Weeks later, standing once again near that same corner cafe, the memory greeted him like an echo. People still whispered when they recognized him, but now those whispers carried something close to admiration. The barista inside met his eyes and handed him the same order black coffee, no sugar, light steam. "It's on the house today," she said with a small shy smile. James smiled back gently. "Thank you," he replied. "But let's keep it fair. That's how we move forward." He left a fresh bill on the counter, its corners crisp, the ink gleaming faintly under the cafe light. Then he stepped back into the morning breeze, coat fluttering slightly in the wind. For him, the world hadn't changed overnight, but now it had direction. Each step was quiet, grounded, certain. The kind of step taken by a man who understood that justice wasn't a destination, but a road he'd spend the rest of his life helping everyone else to walk a little safer.